This is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric. Eric Langridge was born in Lambeth, London in 1925. In the last episode, we learned about my granddad's job on the US Air Force Base, which became known as Greenham Common US Air Force Base. He had responsibility in the snack shop, and as he showed himself capable, the responsibilities increased. And again, like his time on the trains, it was one of the highlights of his life and something he loved greatly. As we continue now into the next part of his story, we learn more about his time on the base and what came next. Life had to go on, and the number of Air Force personnel was increasing all the time. Peace had come to the base at last, and the engineers had all left the area. The runway lights had been installed, as well as the approach landing lights. Things were really buzzing now, and there was an air of expectancy and excitement. We didn't have to wait long for it all to begin. We were visited by some of the Air Force's largest planes. They were making thumping landings to test the flight line strength and also takeoffs using the length of the line to do so. One such plane was a B-36, and it took several approaches before it finally made a successful landing. It also took a lot of runway and skill in taking off, bearing in mind that liftoff was just above the Camp Close housing estate, giving the occupants cause for concern. There were also visits from fighter aircraft who used the full length of the runway for stopping exercises, and it was all very exciting. I had a phone call one day. It was from the base commander stating that I was expected to attend a meeting to be held at headquarters in the company of our PX officer, general manager, PX manager, officers of the Veteran Corps, base engineers, and provost marshal officers. It was obviously important, and we were expected to take note of all relevant information. Secretly, I was very proud to be included, as a lot of the top brass were expected. The meeting eventually took place, and I must admit that at first I was just overwhelmed by the company I was in. It was the first time I had ever seen a 3-star general, and all his attendant officers there were colonels, majors, and captains who were all senior or command pilots. The outcome of the meeting was that we were to become active and a member of SAAC. We would be a base for a flight of B-47s. There could be no possibility of any illness affecting these pilots, and to assure this, the base hygiene program was intensified. No one knew what effects such sickness would have on these high-flying crew, especially having to wear face masks and the stratosphere suits. It was an unknown variable, and nobody wanted to take chances. The vets were on our tails continuously, not only us, but the mess hall, NCO, and the officers' club. Contracts were put out for various items of food to be provided by civilian outlets. But before these contracts, which could be quite a rich source of income, could be granted, the provider had to sign an agreement allowing the vets to visit the premises and promise the work areas would be kept scrupulously clean and possibly redesigned to meet the required standards. Having done so, they were also invited to provide for other bases in the area. This went on for some years until AFEX had their own bakeries and provisions flown in from Germany. Well, the planes eventually arrived, and it was one of my best memories. Can you imagine how it felt to see these beautiful machines land in and taxi into their various aprons? The noise, the hustle and bustle, and the activity was overwhelming. Everybody was full of excitement and straining to see these aircraft. As for the crewmen, they were a different breed of men from what we had been accustomed. They were very proud men, nonchalant and full of self-importance, but they also knew how to enjoy themselves and be light-hearted. One or two became good friends. They all carried a small gun, which they called a life preserver, and it was amusing to see the various methods of how they wore them. There was the G-man with it slung under his armpit, or Billy the Kid with it around his waist, and the tough guy with it strapped just above his ankle. But we all knew that they had a very serious mission in life, and we all respected them. Mr. A.E. Brown had gone now, and now that the base was larger and active, Captain Fairchild and his Goonie bird also left for Wiesbaden in Germany. We now had a Major Felsen in charge of the PX, which had now moved into a building of its own. The telephone was now in full use, and so communication was much improved. My wife was now able to phone me to find out what time I would be home, or whether I would be working overtime. It was so very useful, and a new phase in our lives. A service we take for granted these days. Incidentally, incoming calls were never accepted whenever the planes were flying. We could only suppose that it was for security reasons. Base activities were being modernized. More evening shows and films were taking place. The beer bar had a new building and street lighting was installed. It was often said that the evenings were the best part of the day. The base became very, very busy and had a heavy workload. Personnel were at full capacity, and because of this, it was decided I should have another snack bar near the flight line. It was also on the opposite side of the base, near the Gold Club, and next door was the flight line fire station. The snack bar was called a satellite, long before space travel, and it was obvious that I should offer the management of the activity to my dear friend and co-worker, Peggy. She was perfect for the job and soon built up a wonderful rapport with the base men and visiting crews. In fact, it became more popular than my own snack bar, yet only had half of the facilities. I often tried to visit the site, not to check up on Peggy, but to observe the planes coming in and going out. Because of the volume of trade, I was also allowed to employ 2 supervisors to cover the early and late shifts. This meant my work became more office-orientated, and I didn't have to put in such long hours. My work hours became more flexible. Paperwork was becoming more prevalent now, not just for me, but for all the base personnel, especially as more and more regulations were being introduced. My counterparts at the clubs and the other activities offices often discussed this and were finding the system being choked with increasing amounts of books and paper filing. Security was tightened up at the base entrance. There was only one gate into the base then. It was at a later stage, when the housing was built by the officers' club, that the gate at the back of the base was opened. All vehicles in and out of the base were periodically stopped and checked. The number of visitors was reduced, and if civilians were entering to visit the clubs, they had to have a named sponsor and passes would be issued, with a time for leaving set on it. Any defaulters meant a ban for the visitor and trouble for the sponsor. They were very strict. Even I and members of staff who were very familiar with the guards were refused admission if we didn't have our ID cards. The MPs used to tell a joke about one of their men who was so strict he would report his own partners. He was a big red-headed man and had a haircut which today would be called a skinhead. It gave him a very daunting and fearsome appearance. Anyway, they said that Tom Phillips, an elderly gentleman employed on base as maintenance and handyman, quite honestly no one knew just what he did do or cared, found a job and started to leave the base daily with a wheelbarrow of rubble or rubbish to tip into the pit just outside the gates. Well, the burly MP would stop Tom at the gate and inspect and probe the contents of the barrow to make sure that it was what it was supposed to be. This went on for quite some time, and always this same guard would do his probing bit. The joke was that 2 or 3 weeks later, they found out that the old boy was pinching wheelbarrows. Whether it was true or not, it became quite an embarrassment to the MP. I remember one night I had been working late at the NCO club when I was stopped by the civilian police along the main road. It must have been one of the only nights of the year when I didn't have a goodie bag of tasty food from the club. I now had 31 staff members working for me, and all of them were very good. They had all attended my staff training every week, and I felt I could leave them to run the place. We had not had any cases of sickness, and the vets were becoming less intrusive. It was a good feeling all around. As a token of goodwill and to thank them for their hard work, I suggested we might put on a buffet and dance at the Corn Exchange. Word soon got around among the GIs, and a lot of enthusiasm was generated. It even got to the base commander, who thought it would be a very good public relations exercise, and he offered to hire the hall and a band. And so preparation was started. Each member of the staff would bring an item of food to create a full buffet. The day finally arrived. I had offered to start work at 6 p.m. so that the supervisor and a member of staff could go on downtown to prepare everything. My wife and others would also be there. At 10 p.m. we finished work and filled the minibus which I drove to town. I dropped the girls at the front door and then drove around back to park the bus. I then walked up the alley at the side of the hall to go into the front door, or so I thought. I was met by a giant burly police sergeant who asked me where I thought I was going. He insisted the doors were closed and I should clear off. No matter how much I protested, he was determined I was not going in. So I thought I would try another ploy. I walked down the alley to the stage door and hoped I could arouse somebody's attention. I certainly did. It was him again. He decided I was a public nuisance and put me in an arm lock and sort of frog-marched me to the front door where he sent for assistance. My luck held. When we got to the front door, my wife and 2 or 3 girls had just opened the door to find out what had become of me. They vouched for me, and I was allowed in. Strangely enough, later on in the year, that sergeant had retired from the force, and the next time I saw him, he was the manager of the Customs and Excise store. I suppose that his previous record in the force had stood him in good stead. Unfortunately, the temptation was too much for him, and he was later caught at the gates by Customs and Excise. They decided to prosecute him, and so it became a very sad end to a lifetime career. He died a broken man. Meanwhile, the flying activity was going full strength, although rumour had it that the pilots had found it difficult to get off the ground soon enough before reaching the housing estate. So they were now experimenting with JATO, whatever that was. All I do know was that they were now emitting black smoke as they rose off the ground. One day we were told by various officers that all personnel who were off duty and those that could be spared were allowed to line up along the perimeter track to watch an aircraft that was visiting the base. We all stood there with great expectation, when suddenly from nowhere came this brilliant white streak. It came and went in a second. We were all astounded and stood there with our mouths wide open in amazement. And then it came back again. The noise and speed made our hair stand up at the back of our necks. The next time it came by, it was low and slow, and we could all see that it was pure white and a delta wing. It was obviously top secret and another stage in the history of flying. When it landed later on, it was on the far side of the base where it was kept out of sight. We all dispersed and went back to work. We didn't see it take off, but we certainly heard it, especially when it did a final fly past. We had a lot of these visits, for aircraft were being developed continually, and they would use the base for GCAs and landing practices. Among our new customers to the snack bar was a full-blooded member of the Cherokee Indian tribe who became a very interesting man to talk to. He had been posted to us from Mildenhall and was obviously very experienced in his trade. He was a training sergeant and he drove around in a Morris Traveller. On the bonnet was a full-size painting of a chief in full dress, and on all the panels around the sides and on the back doors were Indian village scenes. It was a very impressive sight and caused a stir wherever he parked it, especially downtown. And of course, some flashy American cars were now appearing on the scene, and they were wonderful. I'll never forget that for some reason or other, I was standing at a bus stop when a young female officer offered me a lift in Newbury. She had a magnificent Buick, and sitting there I felt like royalty. It was such a lush interior, and the car seemed to just glide along the road. It was a whole world of difference compared with my rust bucket. As the base progressed, there was always something new and exciting to see, like the magnificent New York-styled fire engines that arrived for the flight line. Huge transporter lorries, huge fuel bowsers, and a very large flight line road sweepers also arrived. It was quite an eye-opener to see them all in action. The base chapel was also now in full use, as was the hospital. There was also a small school for the children that had been constructed in a billeting building just inside the gate. My younger brother Lionel became the school secretary. We also had a thrift shop, but we were not allowed in there. But there were always nice ladies who would offer me clothing for my 2 daughters. Then came along new products. Old Spice. What was it? Was it a drink or a cooking ingredient? Whoever thought men would wear perfume? But look at it now. It's a colossal trade. Pretzels, what were they? Pumpkin pie, pecans, meat jerkies. The new items were endless, and it was so exciting to be in at the beginning, such as the days that the base was open to the public and we saw barbecues for the first time. We had no idea what spare ribs were, as the English butchers did not cut meat in the same way. They do now. It's become a British pastime. Who would have thought that hamburgers would be an item that would worry the European common market? They say we shouldn't use the name as they do not contain ham. There were new styles of pickles, such as dill and relish, and the new favorite American hot dog mustard. There were wonderful sandwiches and rolls. Every decent cafe in Britain now sells BLTs and filled rolls. We owe so much of our new way of life to the visit of American troops and now American tourists. It has been a wonderful experience in my life meeting and working with the American forces. I made very good friends who made me so very welcome into their world, and it was a great pleasure to have met them. Then came the Brimpton Baptist Church and Pastor Tom and the Americans in the congregation, among whom were Kyle and Terry Butler and family. But soon they were to retire to Tennessee. We still keep in touch with letters. That's the end of the major portion of my granddad's book. There's about 2 pages more that I'll read in just a moment that he updated in 1998. And so I'll read that in a moment. I just wanted to say a brief word about Kyle and Terry Butler. It's thanks to Terry Butler, who's incredibly gifted lady. But thanks to her, we have this book. My grandfather wrote this all out by hand, and she heard of it and she typed it up, and she had 3 hard copies published. And it's one of those copies now that I'm reading, and it's actually the copy that she kept for herself. Terry Butler tragically passed away not too long ago, and when her husband in November of 2021 found the book, he decided that it really should go to one of the family. And I now live in America, and that's a whole other story for another day that I think my granddad would have loved. But I'm living in Pennsylvania, and so Kyle Butler sent me this book, and it's the one that I'm reading from now. There's a few more pages, like I said, updates that he made to his life story that he wrote in 1998. And so I'm going to conclude this podcast by reading those pages. 1998. Now, to bring this up to date, I should mention what became of my siblings and parents. As I mentioned, to some extent, my oldest brother, Don, was adopted by a rich aunt who was able to put him through grammar school and then officer training college. He rose to the rank of first lieutenant and was eventually posted to Burma. He continued to progress and become a captain and was ADC to General Slim. He finally rose to the rank of major and eventually retired. Unfortunately, he had suffered a bout of malaria, which remained with him in civilian life. He then became an accounts manager with Ross Frozen Foods at Grimsby, and he died at the early age of 61, suffering a major heart attack. His dear wife, Joyce, was a young girl in the WAAFs when they met, and they were very devoted. But after she lost Don, she became very low and never got over it. She is now suffering senile dementia, is in an officer's nursing home. As for Lionel, he left the home and went into a bakery at Brighton and became a confectioner. And then the army called him up and he enlisted into the Army Pay Corps. He was stationed at Sutton Scotney, and that's where I finally found him. We used to meet whenever he was on leave. He then got lodgings in Newbury, where he was eventually discharged from service. He then took a job with the civil service and worked at Thatcham Ordnance Depot, and he stayed there until his retirement. When he retired, he received the Distinguished Long Service Medal. It was a great shame he didn't live long enough to really enjoy it. Such a sad loss. The 2 girls had left home before us. Eric refers there to his 2 sisters. Daphne would have been about 8 years old and Edna 6 years. They went to a religious girls' home run by nuns and called Spurgeons. They always stayed together, and although Daphne left first, she found lodgings and kept a place open for Edna. I never saw them again until I came to Newbury on the railway, and having free travel, was able to go about looking for them. I wrote to several organizations, but eventually the Salvation Army was able to track them down. We met several times, but once again lost track. They had both married and separated from each other and disappeared. This time it was Lionel that found them, and we have been in touch ever since. The girls were in touch with Dad, and so knew about what had caused the family to split up. I had always lived with the idea that Mum had died, and I was quite comfortable with that thought, until I phoned and asked Daphne. Apparently, Mum had run away with another bloke. I was very disillusioned. Dad visited us a couple of times in the home, but having remarried, he also disappeared. Olive and I started to look for him, and found he had moved to Nottingham. We went up there and found his house, but when we got there, we didn't have the nerve to knock on the door. It was later that we heard from the girls that Dad had come back from London and was now living in Romford. And so off went Olive and I to find him. We knew that he was working in Price's bakery, and so having asked people the way, we went back to the shop and waited. We had Lionel with us, so it would be quite a reunion. Soon Dad came out to empty some waste, and I called him. He came across, and we told him who I was. He said he dare not stop, but could we meet him at King's Cross Station? So off we went again to the station tea rooms. Dad arrived, had a cup of tea, but couldn't stay long. Worst of all, he asked who this other young man was. Poor Lionel, his heart sank, and he never forgave Dad or met him ever again. And so yet again Dad disappeared. But the girls were still in touch, and at the time of Lionel's wedding, we all thought it would be a surprise for Lionel if we could invite Dad. The girls knew that he was in Dagenham, somewhere, and so off Olive and I went again. This time we went to the local library and looked up the election roll. We found his address, looked in the phone book, and rang him up. He came to the phone, and we told him who we were and asked if we could meet. He was absolutely terrified. He asked us not to go there and not to contact him again. He said we were making his life unbearable. He said it was she who must be obeyed. And so that was the last we saw or heard of Dad. Later on in life, having heard so much about it, I decided that with our free travel, I would take Olive to see St. Luke's home. We arrived at Burgess Hill and were able to walk to the home and find the front gate. It was a long walk, but we were much younger then. Sure enough, the home still stood, but it was obvious that the boys were still at school. So we decided to walk towards them. They would be easy to recognize as they would be marching in file. We reached the school gates and waited and waited. Finally, I decided to ask a school mum if the Lukey boys were out yet, and she said they had gone a long time ago. And when I said that we hadn't seen them marching, she told us that they didn't do that anymore. They now would go home in 2s or 3s. And so it was back to the home again, and this time we would turn the latch and walk in. There were boys playing in the courtyard and on the lawn, trotting about all over the place. We met the master, who was a very nice young man. He made us very welcome and took us on a tour of the home. It was an absolute miracle. The place was completely changed. The dark corridors had gone, everywhere was lit. The boot lockers had gone, the bathrooms and toilet areas were tiled and had individual cubicles. It was all private. There were radiators everywhere, and the place was so warm. The kitchens were restyled and food was collected on a self-serve basis. In the dining room, the benches and trestles were gone, and there were separate tables with tablecloths, and the boys could sit there where they liked. There was a low-toned gong that called them to their meals. As for the schoolroom, that just didn't exist. They had table tennis, game boards, and worktops everywhere, but none of it was being used. The boys were all outside playing. We then went upstairs to the dormitories, and only there weren't any. Now they had bedrooms, personal beds and bedding, beautiful blankets, sheets, and counterpanes. There were bedside lockers with personal table lamps. All the brass plaques had gone, and there were posters of Walt Disney's Snow White and of sportsmen. What a contrast. We couldn't believe it, and we told the master so. He explained that it was all due to a public inquiry stirred up in the press, and the place had been gutted and rebuilt as we saw it. I was a bit disappointed. In a way, I wanted to see Olive to see it as it had been. The next time I went back to Burgess Hill with my daughter Hilary, this time the home had completely gone, and in its place was now a huge roundabout. Greenham Common is also gone now, and after many years of protesters at the gates, those gates have all been torn down. Contractors were called in to clear the rest. We drove around, and it was heartbreaking to see it all destroyed. The only area sealed off was the control tower, which is being restored and will eventually become a centerpiece for public viewing. And that's the end of my granddad's autobiography. Eric passed away on the 21st of June, 2001, which, as I record this, was about 23 years ago. It's amazing to consider the life he had, beginning out with absolutely nothing, just in destitute poverty, abandoned by his own father. At the beginning of his life. And then again, abandoned by his father at the end of his life. But by the grace of God, the life that he made and the man that he became is just incredible. He never stopped learning. He loved books, loved encyclopedias, just reading. He made model railways. He had a spare room where he had just this incredible model railway with just most intricate details. He was the father to his daughters, Sue and Hillary, that he never had. He was a grandfather to me and my brothers that he never had. And a few days before he died, I met my wife. And we've now been married for going on 20 years. My grandfather and my nan were married for over 50 years. And I know he would have loved his great-grandchildren, maybe even more than his grandchildren, and they would have loved him. So I hope you've enjoyed the life story of my grandfather. I'm a preacher, I'm a pastor, and so there's always the temptation to try and make applications and to find truth to apply. But I'm not going to do that. I think my grandfather's life stands on its own merit, and I hope you've enjoyed it.